Avaaz has come up with another idea, a campaign to boycott the World Cup that's scheduled for this June in Moscow.
Unless you're prepared to interfere with markets, control the pricing, control the technologies in deployment, that is not an achievable goal. We have to interfere with these markets. We need public renewable power.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on over 30 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org. Eastern Ghouta is being sliced to pieces by Assad forces assisted by Russian bombing. Rabin Yassin Kassab, the author of Burning Country, reported that 61 people were burned to death by napalm on the day of March 15 in eastern Ghouta. For years, people there lived under siege in basements, but as their areas are being overwhelmed, they are fleeing by the thousands. This is Ahmad Hamdan, an actor and media worker who created the defiant hashtag #IamStillAlive. He was killed this week in Ghouta. Glory to his memory. It is long since past time that Putin's gang faced measures of BDS for its atrocities in Syria. We've discussed the idea of keeping Russian airliners out of U.S. airports as long as Russian planes are bombing in Syria. The online group Avaaz has come up with another idea, a campaign to boycott the World Cup that's scheduled for this June in Moscow. The Avaaz petition has gotten over 400,000 signers in just a couple of days. The trick, though, would be for this effort to be pursued without us getting involved in the dirty state rivalries between the U.S. and Russian governments. March 15th, 2011 was the start of the Syrian democratic uprising. It's been marked in cities all over the world. This banner is being prepared for Chicago. A vote on Bernie Sanders' bill that would get the U.S. out of the Saudi war against Yemen could come as early as March 18th. Have you contacted your senator on this bill? Now, the main stumbling block, of course, is the near unanimous wish by politicians to protect U.S. arms selling companies so they could sell their weapons to the Saudis. But another obstacle is the tactic that was used a couple months ago, substituting a nice-sounding but meaningless bill for one that had teeth. And it may be used next week by Senator Jean Shaheen of New Hampshire. She's advancing such an alternative. Google Senator Shaheen contact. That'll get you the link to her website where you can tell her a piece of your mind. Now, Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the real ruler of Saudi Arabia and the architect of its bloody war against Yemen, is coming to the United States for a 2-week visit in just a few days. For news about protests, check the website saudius.org. Now to news from Democracy Now! About the massive student walkouts on March 14th to protest Congress' obedience to the NRA and its bosses, the U.S. gun industry.
In a historic day of action, more than 1 million students from over 3,000 schools walked out of classes across the country and around the world to protest gun violence Wednesday. Walkouts occurred in all 50 states as well as some overseas. In Littleton, Colorado, hundreds walked out of Columbine High School, site of the 1999 massacre that left 15 people dead. In Madison, Wisconsin, thousands of students walked out and marched on the state capitol building, where they flooded the rotunda and chanted, "We want Walker," outside the office of Republican Governor Scott Walker, who's resisted calls for gun control. In Washington, D.C., protesters placed 14,000 shoes on the lawn of the U.S. Capitol, one for each of the estimated 7,000 children who've died of gunshot wounds since the Sandy Hook school massacre of 2012. Across the mall, hundreds of D.C. area students protested outside the White House, turning their backs on the building and sitting silently for 17 minutes, 1 minute for each person killed at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Florida a month ago. This is 16-year-old Reem Araje and 17-year-old Simone Hicks speaking at the protest.
I hope that the president will step up, stop accepting money from the NRA, because if all the deaths that have occurred aren't enough to convince him, then I guess it just has to be us protesting right now.
There's a missing part to this campaign, however. Calls for measures to stop needless police shootings. Think Michael Brown and Jason Negron. There has to be a campaign to get the guns out of the hands of most police and to do what they do in Britain, to have guns only in the hands of special police squads, guns that are used only in the most desperate of situations. The bulk of our program is selections from a fine talk by Sean Sweeney. He's the director of the International Program of Labor, Climate, and Environment at the Murphy Institute in New York State. He spoke as part of a 350 Connecticut program.
In 2012, after the Rio Plus 20 talks, a few months later, 2 weeks before Superstorm Sandy hit the region, we had a meeting of 70 unions in New York City. And we said, what's really going on here? We're seeing rising emissions. We're seeing rising fossil fuels use, not falling. We're seeing rising energy demand globally to the level of 3% a year, which is having a dramatic effect on the global energy system and the ecology. And yes, renewable energy was rising, and rising very, very quickly. And the renewable energy companies like to tell us that the renewables are the future, so keep investing in us, keep giving us policy supports and subsidies, and then one day we'll have a full 100% renewables economy. But if we look at the data then, and we look at the data now, we see that renewables are on the margins of the global energy system, and will be on the margins for a long time unless we have public renewable power. I'll come back to the economics of that in a moment. So we developed a program called Resist, Reclaim, Restructure, which was the first Trade Unions for Energy Democracy document. And we documented what was really going on in the energy sector. And we said, resist, reclaim, restructure, at least offer some kind of framework to address the realities. First of all, resist the agenda of the fossil fuel companies globally. That more fossil fuels coming on, more refineries, more pipelines, more power stations, that was going to lock in, we've all heard the term carbon lock-in, more emissions for decades to come. If we don't stop it now, we're going to be stuck with those emissions, and the bad situation is going to become catastrophic. Reclaim, the second demand. To reclaim to the public the energy systems that have been privatized. And that also means demarketizing those systems that are still public. Many of them around the world are still publicly owned, but they operate as private companies. They accumulate money, they sell energy, they operate on the global markets. So you have the big ones like Eskom in South Africa, Sinopec in China. They are publicly traded corporations making money for investors. So they're publicly owned, but they act like private companies. So how do we reclaim these companies to serve the public good, which in many cases what they were set up to do in the first place? And lastly, restructure. that we needed a new energy system based on decentralized power, and that would allow communities to have a say in the future of energy systems because renewable energy technologies can be decentralized. So this was the 3 R's, if you like: resist, reclaim, restructure. Now, we all said, well, that's mission impossible because everything is going against us. We have no chance of ever making this happen, but we at least have to have some kind of analysis for unions around the world to at least understand what was really going on and what their allies in the environmental movement should know is going on, because many environmental groups, and I'm sure many of you know this, are kind of enamored with the idea that private renewables are going to be the future and the big bad utilities are the problem. And so therefore, all we got to do is give them some more subsidies and support, and then we'll end up with a low carbon energy system. Now, in the years that have passed since, in the last few years, we've got a different situation, I think, on our hands. The problems of fossil fuel use, as I said, are continuing. This is a global phenomenon. Yes, renewables are growing dramatically, but please, please, and many of you I'm sure know this, don't be fooled by the headlines that renewables are galloping forward at an inexorable speed. A lot of this is messaging. It's messaging for the renewables companies to attract private investment. It's also messaging to the politicians: keep giving us policy support, subsidies. Come back to that in a moment. So what we've done in the ensuing years is to deepen the analysis of this situation. The electricity system is crucial. If we can't control the power system globally, we will not be able to stabilize the climate. It's as simple as that. It's the biggest single contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, the largest consumer of coal by far, and gas. So we've got to decarbonize the power generation systems of the world. On top of that, we need to decarbonize the transport systems, which is the fastest growing greenhouse gas emissions in the world, is in the transport sector right now. So how do we do that? Well, we need more renewable energy so we can have electric fleets, electric public transportation systems. We can't do that without more electricity. Then we have heating and cooling and cooking, all of those things that use fossil fuels. They have to be decarbonized as well. So where's all this electricity going to come from? How are we going to do this? There is a lot that can be accomplished by energy conservation. This is a very neglected area. But let's say, yes, there are some areas there where we can have less energy use, or to reduce at least the growth in energy production. That's true. But then we've got 1.2 billion people who don't have electricity. So where are they going to get their electricity from if we want them to have a reasonable quality of life? So the good news is we know a number of things. We know that there's plenty of wind, sun, and wave and water power in the world, that a tiny fraction of it was harnessed, we would have enough electricity. The question is getting from that potential to a full decarbonization. So it gets a little bit wonky and technical, but here's, I think, where it comes down to real politics at the moment. Let's take Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders has put a bill in the Senate, and as is Tulsi Gabbard in the House, which is an aspirational bill, of course, at this time. But it basically says we want 100%, the US to be 100% off fossil fuels by 2050. And the Gabbard bill is calling for 80% renewable energy by 2027. Does anybody know how much renewable energy is in the US system now? If you take hydro out, it's about 8 or 9%. So wind and solar is growing, but it's still a long way to go before it gets to that level. Hydro is largely static because it's the old dam systems that were established in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s under the New Deal. So where the growth has going to come, it has to come from wind and solar. The bill doesn't say how it's going to happen. It just said states have to be authorized to make sure they get their power from renewable sources. Unless you're prepared to interfere with markets, control the pricing, control the technologies in deployment, that is not an achievable goal. We have to interfere with these markets. We need public renewable power. So it's a very practical question. This isn't big picture pie in the sky stuff. We have to deal with it. Now, how? Let me just spend a couple of minutes. How am I doing for time? I'm good, thank you. All right, so that's a license to go on for another 20 minutes. So bear with me when I deal with a little bit of the economics of public power, because I'd like you to think about it and come back to me on it, cross-examine if you can. Let's have a debate about it. But it's crucially important to put forward this idea at this particular point in time. What makes renewable, where does the cost of renewable energy come from today? If we look at the model that was introduced in Europe with the privatization of the power systems, and eventually all over the world, the privatization of power, was to break up the old systems of power generation and unbundle them into competing units. This was before climate change was considered to be a very serious problem. So then the narrative becomes, if you want to protect the climate and reduce emissions, we have to have competitive electricity markets. The renewables companies, of course, wanted a piece of the action, and they echoed that message, saying, these fossil fuel companies, these incumbent utilities are the problem, we're the solution, give us your support. Now, when we interrogate the economics of renewable power, what we see is this: the single most expensive part of it is the borrowing of capital. That's more costly than anything else. The fuel is cheap, there is no fuel. The sun doesn't come with a price tag, neither does the wind. The biggest cost is the price of borrowing money. And the reason why that price is high is because renewables are in a risky situation. Why are they in a risky situation? Because they are in a competitive market. The competitive market was put in place by the privatizers 30 years ago, thinking that was going to reduce costs. What it did was raise the risk for renewable energy companies. Everybody in the energy sector is at risk now. So what you have is investors look at that and say, we're not going anywhere near this. Used to be, your pension fund used to be in Con Edison or whatever the utility was. It didn't make much money, but it was a safe investment. Now, investors look at the traditional sector and the renewable sector and say, too risky. You don't want to put your money there. So the investment goes down. So then the message comes, well, how do we reach the climate targets? Well, we need to provide certainties to the investors. What is a certainty? A power purchase agreement. The power purchase agreement basically says, you agree in writing to buy power from me, a wind company or a solar company, at such and such a price. This price has to be enough to compensate the return on investment for the people who've invested in it, plus our profit levels. So what we have is built-in high costs that can only be reduced at this stage by subsidies. And it might be argued, well, what's wrong with a few subsidies? We subsidize fossil fuels, why can't we subsidize renewable energy? The problem has been, where it has happened, is the cost of the subsidies gets passed on to the consumers. It doesn't get passed on to the fossil fuel companies, it gets passed on to everybody else. So there's been a major pushback in Europe, which was the leader in renewable energy for the last 10 or 15 years. Germany is often used as an example. Investment in renewables have collapsed. So why has it collapsed? It's because they took away the subsidies and the companies couldn't stand. They couldn't, because of their costs of borrowing, they couldn't establish a foothold in the power sector, and we're seeing a reversal. Now, how do we avoid this? This is where we need to be clear. We need to lower the cost of capital. How do we do that? The best thing to do is not have private companies do it. Have public renewable energy companies established. That can, like the old systems of health, education, and power generation in utilities, you build the stuff, and then you charge a user fee, and then you pay back what you've had to put into the system. If you take the high interest rates out, because you're a government entity, you can borrow at a much lower level than if you're a private entity. They know that you can raise taxes to pay it. So a bank is going to say, oh, well, it's a government entity, it's not going to go broke. That lowers the risk and lowers the cost of borrowing. Then, when they produced the electricity, you then have a situation where you own and control the installations. It's not owned by a private company charging a power purchase agreement. So, in the few minutes I've got left, I want to say, so where is this analysis going? The other thing about reducing the cost is to do it at scale. If we're going to take the climate targets seriously, 85% reduction, net zero emissions, according to the Paris Agreement, by 2060, if we're going to take that seriously, it needs a massive deployment of renewable power. That will bring down the cost. That's the good news, because the more you do, the cheaper it's going to be. And so the programs of public renewable power make absolute sense from an economic standpoint. Now, who's running with this? Or is this so pie in the sky, it really is a waste of time? In the unions, which is where I mostly operate, we've seen unions picking up campaigns for public renewable power in many parts of the world now and beginning to change the narrative. Just in my own work with Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, we've got in Australia, the Queensland Labour Party has adopted public renewable power instead of power purchase agreements. In Canada, Naomi Klein and the LEAP Manifesto advocating for public power. In the Philippines, the public cooperative systems, which were built under the rural electrification, are threatened with privatization. The Filipino unions and the climate justice movements are fighting to defend public co-ops and urging them, giving them the opportunity to go into the development of renewables. In Nepal, which is rich in hydroelectric power, public renewable power is on the agenda of the left-wing government that was elected a few weeks ago. In Puerto Rico, there is a struggle over the threatened privatization of the utility. The utility isn't a particularly good utility, PREPA, quite a bad utility, very corrupt. But the movement there is demanding a new PREPA based on transparency, based on community control, to transition towards renewable technologies. I think the most encouraging example is the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, and I'll conclude on this with the 2 or so minutes I have left. 3 years ago, I went to Britain and we met with the unions, and they said, so what is this project, Trade Unions for Energy Democracy? We see you've got a few unions from Britain involved. We said, yeah, well, we believe that we need to have public power. We need to take back the power system in order to meet the climate targets, in order to drive renewables and have a fairer energy system. They said, well, that's never going to happen. It's mission impossible. It's not going to happen. I said, well, yeah, I know it may not happen. It's maybe difficult now, but who knows what's going to happen 3 or 4 years from now? They said, well, we don't see it happening. So we got some unions involved and some unions who frankly sat on the fence. What happens? Corbyn decides he's going to run for leader of the Labour Party. He scribbles down a programme which included reclaiming the power system, which had been very poorly managed and de-invested under the privatisation system. It wasn't really much to do with climate change. It was more just it was a badly run, now multinational run system. Then, of course, he fights the general election on the same programme, public renewable power. And they said, oh, he's got no chance, he's going to be annihilated by Theresa May. And he ended up coming within 1% of a victory against Theresa May on a left-wing programme with all the major media against him. Of course, the Sanders campaign and the Corbyn campaign were talking to each other. The Sanders has put the bill in the Senate on the high level of ambition on climate protection. The same conversation is going on. Last September, a few months after the election, Jeremy Corbyn addressed the Trade Union Congress in Brighton, and the vote to support public renewable power, renationalisation and basically remunicipalisation of the power system was passed unanimously. Now, what does this mean? It means that if there's a Labour government, the shadow minister, Rebecca Long-Bailey, met with the unions involved in this project, Unions for Energy Democracy, and said, we really don't know how to do this. This is not going to be easy. How do we take back the power system? So we're now in the process of developing an implementation plan that in the event, and I think it's a very strong possibility that Corbyn could be the next Prime Minister, that they will reclaim the power system. You say, well, that's only one country. But the crisis in the European renewable system, which is privately owned, is so deep right now that if Britain led the way, it could have an effect on Europe. And Europe has been the policy leader for the world around privatization, power purchase agreements, and private renewable power. So even though it gets a bit wonky and a bit technical, and we still have an enormous mountain to climb, I'd urge us all to try to take on board this idea of public renewable power. Let's do it on a non-profit basis. Let's control the power system. Let's move forward in the years ahead to decarbonize the transport system, the heating systems, and try to reclaim the energy sector. Because if we can't reclaim the energy sector, there won't be climate justice. There will not be equality. We need to include all communities, all unions, all organizations in that struggle, but to be clear about what the objectives are. And I think we have a chance of real success. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Monday, March 26th is the next court appearance of Vic Lancia, who was arrested in front of a Wells Fargo bank last April because he blockaded the door in a righteous pipeline protest. This is a bit of bio from an interview I did with him after his first court appearance.
I started becoming radicalized and aware of what was going on when I was in the Air Force from 61 to 65. I missed Vietnam by that much. Okay, I was an airman on a officer's playground, and I got that feeling of class and caddying for colonels and getting $1 tip, and after dirtying my uniform, and I was pretty much nonconformist. And I'm going to be proud to say that I did not get a good conduct medal in the Air Force. Okay, and that's something I'm very proud of. And I remember watching the Freedom Riders on television. I said, "Whoa, I wish I was there." And I remember being very, very inspired about Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. You know, so by the time I got out of the Air Force, whereby I got a couple of years of college while I was there, I wanted to get involved. And then in '67, that's my first arrest. I got arrested with the Great Boycott thing with Wesleyan students, by the way.
See the rest of the interview on our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media. If you can get to Middletown on March 26th, please show up in Superior Court in the morning to support Vic Lancia. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.